The 1950s. Secret switch. Farmers used to start dead engines after blizzards, farm wisdom. The blizzard hit Johnson County, Iowa just after midnight on February 7, 1953. By dawn, the wind had piled snow 8 feet high against barn walls, buried fence lines completely, and dropped temperatures to 12 below zero. For the dairy farmers scattered across those rolling hills, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis that could cost them everything. Tom Anderson stood in his barn that morning, staring at his John Deere Model B tractor. The engine was frozen solid. Outside, 28 Holstein cows needed to be milked within the hour, or they'd develop mastitis and potentially die. The milk truck was supposed to arrive by noon, weather permitting, but without the tractor, he couldn't clear the lane. Without cleared access, the milk would spoil in the tank, and a week's income would vanish. His family of 5 depended on that check. But the real problem wasn't just the cold. It was that his tractor, like thousands of others across the Midwest that winter, simply wouldn't start. This wasn't unusual. Farmers in the 1940s and 50s dealt with engine problems every winter. These weren't the computerized machines we see today. These were simple gasoline or diesel engines, and when temperatures plunged below zero, everything conspired against them. Engine oil thickened into something resembling molasses. Fuel lines froze. Batteries lost most of their cranking power. Carburetors iced over. And most critically, the fuel itself stopped vaporizing properly. Gasoline needs to vaporize to burn, and in sub-zero temperatures, it simply wouldn't cooperate. The official solution from tractor dealers and manufacturers was straightforward but impractical. They told farmers to keep their tractors in heated barns overnight. But most family farms in the 1950s didn't have heated machine sheds. Heating oil cost money they didn't have, and many farms were still getting by with simple pole barns that offered shelter from snow but nothing more. The dealers also suggested removing the battery each night and keeping it warm indoors, then reinstalling it each morning. This worked, but it was time-consuming. And when you had livestock depending on you, time was something you couldn't waste. Some farmers tried pouring hot water over the engine block, hoping to warm the metal enough to get things moving. This sometimes worked, but it was risky. Thermal shock could crack the block, turning a starting problem into a $1,000 replacement job. Others tried building small fires under the oil pan, which was even more dangerous. More than one barn burned down because someone got careless with an open flame near fuel lines. But there was another way. A method that didn't appear in any operator's manual, wasn't recommended by any dealer, and would have horrified the engineers who designed these machines. Yet it worked. And it spread through farming communities by word of mouth, passed from neighbor to neighbor, demonstrated at grain elevators and auction barns, shared over coffee at small-town diners on Saturday mornings. Tom had learned about it the previous winter from an older farmer named Earl Peterson, who'd been working the land since the Depression. Earl had showed up one particularly brutal morning when Tom's tractor had been dead for 2 days. He'd watched Tom struggle with the starter for 20 minutes, listened to the weak groan of the battery, and finally said, "You ever heard of ether?" Ether, diethyl ether, to be precise. It was a chemical compound that had been used as an anesthetic in medical procedures since the 1840s. It had an extremely low boiling point, which meant it vaporized almost instantly, even in cold temperatures, and it was highly flammable. Mix it with air in the right proportions, add a spark, and you got an explosion, which was exactly what an internal combustion engine needed. The practice had started during World War II, when farmers were under pressure to maintain production with aging equipment and limited resources. Someone, somewhere, probably a farmer with a background in mechanics, or maybe even medicine, realized that a small amount of ether sprayed directly into an engine's air intake would vaporize instantly and ignite easily, giving the engine the boost it needed to fire up even in extreme cold. The technique spread rapidly through rural communities, becoming part of the unwritten knowledge that kept farms running. By the early 1950s, ether starting fluid was being manufactured specifically for this purpose. Small cans with spray nozzles appeared in farm supply stores, usually kept behind the counter. The cans came with vague instructions and stern warnings about proper use, but the real education happened in the field. Experienced farmers taught the younger generation the technique, emphasizing the critical details that separated success from disaster. Earl had explained it to Tom that first time with the careful precision of someone who'd seen what happened when you got it wrong. You only need a short burst, maybe 2 seconds. Any more and you risk hydrolocking the cylinder or blowing the head gasket. You spray it into the air cleaner intake while someone cranks the engine. The timing has to be right. Too early and it dissipates, too late and you've wasted it. And never ever use it on a hot engine or one that's already running. The danger was real. Ether was explosive. If you sprayed too much, you could damage the engine internally. The sudden pressure spike from an ether-assisted start could crack pistons, bend connecting rods, or blow gaskets. If you got careless with the can itself and created an open flame nearby, you could cause a fire. The fumes were also potent. Inhaling them could cause dizziness, and prolonged exposure was harmful. The manufacturers knew all of this, which was why the official recommendation was always to avoid cold weather starting problems through proper storage and maintenance, not to use chemical shortcuts. But the reality of farm economics made those official recommendations largely irrelevant. Family farms operated on tight margins. Every piece of equipment had to work when needed, regardless of weather. Livestock didn't care about proper storage procedures. Crops didn't wait for ideal conditions. When your livelihood depended on getting a tractor started so you could feed cattle before they weakened or clear snow before the milk truck arrived, you used the tools available to you. And if that meant a carefully controlled spray of ether to bring a frozen engine back to life, then that's what you did. The technique required knowledge and respect. You had to understand your engine. Different models had different air intake configurations. Some had accessible air cleaners mounted on top of the carburetor. Others had more complex intake systems. You needed to know exactly where to spray for maximum effectiveness. You also had to understand the condition of your battery. If it was too weak to turn the engine over at all, ether wouldn't help. The engine had to be able to rotate, creating compression in the cylinders. The ether provided an easily ignitable fuel source, but the engine still needed to perform the basic mechanical functions of compression and spark. Farmers also learned to read their engines, to distinguish between different types of starting problems. If the engine turned over easily but didn't fire, that suggested a fuel delivery or ignition problem that ether might solve. If the engine barely turned over at all, the problem was likely mechanical, either from thick oil or a weak battery, and you needed to address those issues first. Some farmers would jack up one rear wheel of their tractor, which reduced the load on the engine and made it easier to turn over. Others would drain the oil while it was still warm at the end of the day, heat it on a stove overnight, and pour it back in before starting the next morning. The social dimension of this knowledge was important. In tight-knit rural communities of the 1950s, information flowed through informal networks. The county extension agent might not tell you about ether, but your neighbor would. The dealer wouldn't recommend it, but the retired farmer who hung around the implement store would demonstrate the technique if you asked. Young men learned it from their fathers, who'd learned it from the previous generation. Women who managed farms after their husbands died in the war learned it from hired men or neighbors. This knowledge represented practical wisdom, accumulated through experience, tested under real-world conditions, and refined over time. There was also an element of mechanical intuition involved. Good farmers developed a feel for their equipment. They could hear subtle differences in how an engine cranked. They knew from experience how long to spray, when to try a second burst if the first didn't work, and when to stop and try a different approach. This intuition came from constant interaction with machines, from maintaining and repairing equipment themselves, rather than relying on professional mechanics for every problem. In an era before widespread mechanization made farming more dependent on dealers and specialists, this kind of hands-on knowledge was essential. The economic context made this even more critical. A service call from a mechanic in the 1950s could cost a full day's work, assuming you could even get someone to come out in a blizzard. Most farmers did their own repairs by necessity. They kept small inventories of common parts, improvised solutions when parts weren't available, and developed workarounds for chronic problems. Ether starting fluid represented another tool in this repertoire. a chemical solution to a mechanical problem that saved time and money when used properly. But the technique wasn't without controversy within farming communities. Some farmers viewed it as risky and unnecessary, a shortcut that could lead to expensive engine damage. They argued that proper preparation, storing tractors correctly, and using block heaters eliminated the need for such measures. Others saw it as an essential tool, particularly on farms where facilities were limited and weather could change suddenly. These debates happened at coffee shops, grain elevators, and farm auctions, part of the ongoing conversation about proper equipment care. The manufacturers occupied an interesting position in all of this. They couldn't officially endorse using ether because of the liability risks. If they recommended it and someone damaged their engine or caused an injury, the company could be held responsible. But they were aware that farmers used it extensively. Some companies began designing tractors with easier cold weather starting in mind, improving battery capacity, refining carburetor designs, and developing better cold weather fuels. Others quietly acknowledged the practice by ensuring their engines could tolerate occasional ether use without catastrophic failure. By the late 1950s, diesel engines were becoming more common on larger farms. Diesel presented even greater cold weather challenges because diesel fuel gels in cold temperatures and compression ignition requires higher cylinder pressures. Yet ether proved even more valuable for diesel engines. A small burst of ether in the air intake would ignite from the heat of compression, bringing the engine to life even when diesel fuel alone wouldn't cooperate. This made ether starting fluid increasingly common in farming regions where diesel tractors were becoming standard equipment. The practice also reflected broader patterns in how rural communities approached technology. Farmers in the mid-20th century were innovators by necessity. They adapted equipment for uses manufacturers never intended, developed field repairs that kept machines running past their expected lifespan, and shared knowledge that helped everyone survive difficult conditions. This culture of practical innovation extended beyond starting fluid to encompass countless other techniques, from welding repairs on broken implements to modifying equipment for specific local conditions. Safety knowledge was part of this shared wisdom. Experienced farmers taught newcomers not just how to use ether, but how to do it safely. They emphasized proper ventilation, keeping the can away from heat sources, and never spraying near open flames. They explained warning signs of excessive use, like damaged spark plugs or scored cylinder walls. They taught that ether was a tool for occasional use in genuine emergencies, not a daily crutch for poor maintenance. This informal education system, passed through demonstration and conversation, helped prevent many accidents that could have occurred if people had simply read the can and experimented on their own. The gender dynamics were also noteworthy. While farming in the 1950s was heavily male-dominated, women who managed farms or worked alongside husbands often needed the same mechanical knowledge. Some of the most skilled equipment operators were women who'd taken over farms during the war years and never left. They learned ether starting techniques just like men did, and they passed that knowledge to their children. This practical expertise existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with, the social expectations of the era. Environmental awareness was limited during this period, but farmers did understand waste and efficiency. They used ether sparingly, not primarily for environmental reasons, but because it cost money, and because excessive use damaged engines. This practical conservation aligned with the broader farm ethic of not wasting resources. Everything from baling twine to engine oil was used carefully and often repurposed. Ether starting fluid fit into this pattern of making limited resources stretch as far as possible. The technique also connected to broader mechanical literacy. Farmers who understood why ether worked, who grasped the basic principles of internal combustion and fuel vaporization, were better equipped to diagnose and solve a range of equipment problems. This knowledge made them less dependent on outside experts and more capable of keeping their operations running under adverse conditions. It represented a form of technical education that happened informally but was highly effective. Regional variations existed in how the practice was understood and implemented. In the upper Midwest, where temperatures regularly dropped below zero, ether use was extremely common and viewed as almost routine during winter months. In milder climates, it was less necessary and therefore less widely known. In mountainous regions where altitude affected engine performance, farmers adapted the technique based on their specific conditions. These regional differences reflected the diversity of American agriculture and the ways local knowledge developed to address local challenges. The practice eventually declined as technology improved. Block heaters became more affordable and common. Battery technology advanced, providing more reliable cold weather cranking power. Engine designs improved, with better sealing, improved fuel systems and features specifically designed for cold weather operation. Modern diesel engines often incorporate glow plugs or grid heaters that warm the intake air, eliminating the need for starting fluid in most conditions. Climate-controlled machine sheds became more common as farms grew larger and more specialized. But for farmers working through the 1940s, 50s and 60s, ether starting fluid represented an essential tool. It was part of a larger toolkit of practical knowledge that kept farms running when conditions were difficult. It exemplified the ingenuity and adaptability that characterized rural American communities during this era. And it demonstrated how unofficial knowledge, passed through informal channels, often proved more valuable than the official instructions from manufacturers who designed equipment in climate-controlled facilities far from the realities of daily farm work. Tom Anderson got his tractor started that February morning in 1953. He carefully removed the air cleaner, had his teenage son ready at the starter, and delivered a precise 2-second burst of ether into the intake. The engine caught on the second revolution, coughed once, and settled into a rough idle that smoothed out as it warmed. Within 20 minutes, he had the lane cleared and was back inside to help with milking. The milk truck arrived on schedule and the crisis passed. Years later, Tom would teach his own sons the same technique, along with all the cautions and details that Earl Peterson had taught him. They would use it less frequently as equipment improved, but the knowledge remained part of what they understood about keeping a farm running. It was one piece of a much larger body of practical wisdom that defined rural American life in the mid-20th century, knowledge that was never written in manuals, but was essential nonetheless. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this look into farm wisdom from the 1950s interesting, please subscribe to our channel for more content exploring the practical knowledge and ingenuity of rural America. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who appreciates agricultural history. This video is inspired by real facts and historical practices, and it does not aim to represent or offend anyone. The techniques described reflect actual methods used by farmers during this era, shared here for educational and historical purposes.